Welcome, dear listener. Take a deep breath, soft and unhurried. Let the weight of the day begin to drift away, like snow falling into stillness. This is your time now, a time for rest, for quiet, for softness. As you settle deeper into your pillows, let your body grow heavy and calm. The world outside can wait. All that matters here is the gentle rhythm of your breath and the story that will unfold slowly, like a lantern glowing in the snow. Tonight we will wander together into a quiet village covered in white, where the hush of winter carries whispers in the wind. And in this place, where every snowflake seems to pause in midair before touching the earth, a tender story begins, a story of names carried on the breeze, and a love that feels as though it has always been waiting. Close your eyes if you wish. Allow yourself to drift into this world of soft snow, glowing windows, and breath that curls into the night air. And now let us begin. The village lay quiet beneath its blanket of snow, the rooftops softened into rounded shapes, the streets hushed as though they belonged to another time. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the faint scent of pine and oak logs burning in the hearths within. In a small wooden house at the edge of the village lived Lucien, a man who had grown accustomed to the silence of winter nights. He would often sit at his window, a candle flickering beside him, and watch the snow drift past in delicate spirals. He listened to the wind, always the wind. It was a habit he never outgrew, pausing at the close of the day, resting his elbows on the windowsill and letting the sounds of the world wrap around him. The hush of snowfall, the creak of branches, the occasional cry of an owl, but most of all, the whispering breath of the night air. There was something in it, something he couldn't explain. For many years, he thought it was only his imagination. The way the wind curled around corners and slipped between rooftops. Yet at times, in the quietest hours, it almost sounded like words, like a voice. Soft and fleeting, barely there at all, but with a tenderness that brushed against his heart. He never told anyone. The villagers would have smiled kindly, but they would not have understood. So he kept it to himself, keeping the nightly ritual, like a secret between him and the winter sky. On this night, with frost painting the edges of the window and the candlelight glowing against the glass, Lucien leaned closer, listening more carefully than ever before. The snow fell more thickly than usual, muting the village until it felt like a dream. And then, through the hush, he heard it, a breath of wind. Carrying a name. It was so soft, so delicate, that he thought it must be a trick of his weary mind. But it came again, this time clearer. A single name, spoken like a sigh. It was a name he had never spoken, a name he had never heard in the village. Yet the moment it touched his heart, it felt as though it belonged there, as though he had always known it, always carried it somewhere deep within him. Lucien closed his eyes, repeating it silently, not daring to speak it aloud. The sound of it filled him with both wonder and calm, like a memory that was not his own, returning gently through the snow. And as he listened, the candle flickered lower and the snow outside thickened, the world folding into stillness. That night he stayed by the window longer than ever before, waiting for the wind to speak again. And though the hours slipped past, he did not grow tired. He only felt a quiet longing, as if the name was leading him toward something he could not yet see. Something or someone waiting beyond the edge of the village, in the hush of winter's breath. The night after hearing the name for the first time, Lucien could think of little else. It lingered in his thoughts like a soft echo, as though the wind had placed it gently upon his heart and asked him to keep it safe. All throughout the day, he went about his quiet routine, splitting firewood, mending small things around the cottage, feeding the birds that always seemed to gather near his window. Yet even as he moved through these familiar motions, the name floated in the back of his mind, unspoken but alive. When evening returned, heavy with snow and silence, Lucien felt a pull he could not resist. Instead of remaining at the window as he always did, he wrapped himself in a thick woolen cloak, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside into the drifting white. The air met him softly, wrapping around him in waves of cool breath. His footprints pressed into the untouched snow, and behind him the warm glow of his cottage windows faded slowly until only the soft light of the moon and stars guided his way. The village lay hushed, every rooftop softened, every street winding. Like a ribbon beneath the snow, he passed by the chapel with its lantern glowing faintly in the steeple, and the small bakery with shutters drawn tight. All was still, as if the world were listening. And then the wind came again. It curled around him with a familiar hush, carrying the same name as the night before. This time it was clearer, as though the air itself wanted him to follow. Lucien paused, his breath rising like silver threads, and turned toward the hills beyond the village. There, the snow lay deeper, untouched, waiting. The wind seemed to sigh in that direction, brushing past his cheek, urging him on with its quiet song. So he followed. The path was gentle but long, winding between bare trees whose branches sparkled with frost. Snowflakes fell steadily, each one a tiny shimmer that disappeared the moment it touched his cloak, and with every step the world seemed to soften further until it no longer felt like a path he had walked before, but something dreamlike. A place between waking and memory. The whispers came and went, faint as a sigh, yet always repeating that same name. And though he had never seen the one it belonged to, the sound filled him with a strange sense of familiarity, as though the journey itself was guiding him home. He reached a small clearing where the snow lay smooth and unbroken, and paused to rest. His breath rose in the air, mingling with the falling snow, while the silence pressed gently around him. He could almost imagine he was walking through someone else's memory, snowflakes falling like sighs, shadows shifting like thoughts, and still the wind whispered. Lucien closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound carry through him. It was not a command, not even a plea. It was more like an invitation, a quiet beckoning to keep going, to see where the path would lead. And so, after a long pause, he stepped forward again, deeper into the hills, following the name carried on. Winter's breath, the snow crunched softly beneath his boots. The trees bent gently toward him, heavy with frost. The night sky stretched vast and clear, stars flickering like distant candles, and in that quiet, Lucien felt a tender certainty grow within him, that whoever this name belonged to, wherever the wind was leading, it was not by chance. It was as though two lives had been circling each other for a long time, carried by the seasons, waiting for this very moment of quiet recognition. And with each step deeper into the hills, Lucien felt less alone. The climb into the hills was slow and steady, each step pressing gently into the white hush beneath him. The path grew narrower, lined with trees that leaned overhead, their branches glistening like strands of glass in the moonlight. Lucy unmoved. Carefully, his breath steady, his cloak drawn close around his shoulders. The air was colder here, sharper, yet filled with a strange sweetness, and with every soft gust, the wind seemed to brush past his ear, repeating the name that had haunted and comforted him for nights. At last, the trees thinned, and the hill began to open into a wide crest. The snow lay smooth and untouched, reflecting the pale glow of the moon above. Lucien paused at the edge, gazing out across the vastness of the valley, where the village lights shimmered faintly below, like stars fallen to earth. But he was not Alone. At first, he thought it was a trick of the snow, a figure shaped by the shadows. Yet as his eyes adjusted, he saw her. A woman standing in the open whiteness, her cloak falling softly around her, her face lifted toward the sky. She was very still, her eyes closed as though listening. The wind curled gently around her, stirring strands of her hair, brushing past. Her shoulders, carrying the same faint whispers Lucien had followed. He watched as her breath rose in the air, slow and even, as though she too had come to this place not by chance, but by quiet invitation. For a long moment, Lucien did not move. He simply stood at the edge of the hill, heart softened with wonder, watching the way she seemed to belong to the silence. And then, as though she had felt his presence, the woman opened her eyes. Her gaze met his across the snowy crest, steady and calm. There was no surprise in her expression, no startle at seeing a stranger, only a softness, as if she had been waiting for this moment for him. The wind sighed between them, carrying the name once more. Her name. Lucien's lips parted. Slightly, the sound familiar now, woven into his heart. He whispered it into the night, barely more than breath. And when he did, she smiled. It was a small smile, tender and quiet, but it carried with it the warmth of recognition, as though she had heard his voice before, not here, not in this lifetime, but somewhere beneath the surface of dreams. Neither of them moved closer, not yet. It was enough to stand there, with the snow falling around them, the wind curling between them, and the hush of the world holding them gently in place. They listened together, side by side, though still apart, as the whispers quieted into a calm stillness, as if the wind, having carried them to one another, could now rest. In that silence, Lucien felt something within him soften completely. A sense of home, of belonging, of finally arriving where he was meant to be. And though no words passed between them beyond her name, everything was said in the stillness they shared. For a while, they simply stood there, two figures on a snowy crest, the hush of winter folding around them like a blanket. The moon shone softly, painting silver upon the snow, and the wind, now gentler, seemed content to linger rather than rush past. Lucien found himself stepping forward, slowly, carefully, as though not to disturb the fragile magic of the moment. His boots pressed softly into the snow, leaving a quiet trail behind him. And she, the woman who had smiled at the sound of her own name on his lips, did not move away. She only watched him, her gaze calm, as if she too had been waiting for this closeness. At last, they stood only a few paces apart. Up close, Lucien saw the soft curve of her features, the faint flush of warmth on her cheeks from the cold, the gentle rhythm of her breath misting into the night, and her eyes steady, luminous, filled with a familiarity that unsettled and soothed him at once. "You've heard it too," she said softly, her voice carrying like a feather on the wind. Lucien nodded, almost unable to speak for so long. "I thought it was only me." Her smile deepened, wistful and knowing. "I thought the same. Since childhood, I would hear it, a voice carried on the wind, always calling, always the same, but never understood until now." Her words trembled with recognition, and Lucien felt something stir deep within him, a thread gently pulling between them. He realized that the whispers had never been meant for one alone. They were a bridge, a quiet thread woven through seasons, leading them to this meeting beneath the winter sky. "I never knew why it felt so familiar," Lucien whispered, his breath curling in the night. "But now, standing here, it feels as though it was always you." The woman lowered her gaze for a moment, as if to steady herself, then lifted it again with eyes that glimmered like frost catching moonlight. "And it was always you." No more words were needed. The silence Between them was not empty, it was full. Full of winters past, where each had heard the same sigh in the wind, full of unspoken longing carried across nights they did not yet share. Lucien felt the stillness of the world around them, the trees heavy with frost, the stars scattered in quiet watchfulness, the snow falling in slow spirals. And within that stillness, he felt her presence like warmth, like something both new and eternal. The wind stirred once more, a soft exhale through the branches. But this time it carried no names, only silence, a silence that belonged to them. Now, Lucien and the woman stood closer, their cloaks brushing lightly, their breaths mingling in the cold air. No grand vows, no explanations, only the quiet certainty that they had been led here for one another, and that the whispers of the wind had finally completed their journey. In that hush, they knew. The wind had quieted, for the first time in as long as Lucien could remember. There was no whisper in the air, no faint name carried across the night. Instead, there was a deep and gentle silence, like the pause after a song, where every note still lingers softly in the heart. He stood beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence beneath the heavy folds of her cloak. The snow continued to fall, slow and unhurried, settling on their shoulders, their hair, their boots pressed into the untouched white. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Lucien felt a kind of peace unfurl within him, the kind that arrives only when something long yearned for is finally understood. It wasn't a joy that burned brightly, but one that glowed steadily, like the embers of a fire, gentle and enduring. The woman let out a soft breath, a sigh that misted into the air and drifted away. "It's strange," she murmured quietly. "To think that all these years we were listening to the same wind." Lucien turned his gaze to her, his voice low and warm, strange. "And yet it feels as though it could never have been otherwise." Her lips curved into a small, tender smile. She lowered her head slightly, as though leaning into the hush of his words, and in that quiet gesture, Lucien felt something settle, a stillness that reached deeper than words could carry. They walked a little, side by side, across the crest of the hill. Their footsteps pressed parallel trails into the snow. Two paths that would remain there until the next fall covered them gently. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, watching, listening, as if even the stars wished not to disturb their closeness. After a time, they stopped and simply stood together, gazing out at the valley below. The faint lights of the village flickered like tiny lanterns in the distance. The air smelled faintly of pine, of cold, of snowflakes that melted the instant they touched skin. Lucien let his hand drift slowly from his side, his fingers brushing against hers beneath the folds of their cloaks. A quiet touch, hesitant, almost wondering. She did not pull away. Instead, her fingers curled gently, finding his as though they had always known the shape of his hand. They stood like that, hand in hand, wrapped in silence, their breaths rising together into the night. The wind stirred faintly once more, but not as a whisper of names. It was softer now, more like a lullaby, a hush, a resting sigh. Lucien closed his eyes, letting the moment seep into him. This was not the end of the story, nor even the beginning. It was simply a still point, a place of peace, where longing had given way to quiet presence. And beside him, she too seemed to rest in that calm. Her hand warm in his, her gaze lifted toward the stars, her breath mingling with his own. The world continued on around them, snow falling, branches bending, stars flickering, but for Lucien, time had grown slow, as though the night itself wished to cradle them in its arms, and in that stillness, nothing more was needed. The night deepened, the stars leaning lower in their quiet watch, as though they too wished to rest upon the snow. Lucien and the woman stood hand in hand at the crest of the hill, the silence between them rich and steady, filled with a peace that felt older than words. The snow fell more softly now, as if the sky itself were growing tired. Flakes landed gently on their shoulders, on their hair, on the folds of their cloaks. The world seemed to hush itself into stillness, the kind of stillness that holds you, keeps you, asks you to surrender to its calm. Lucien turned his head slightly, his gaze resting on her. She looked serene, her face touched by moonlight, her breath rising slow and steady. He realized then that he did not need to know her past or her story or anything beyond this moment. What mattered was the quiet recognition between them, the way their hands fit together, the way the silence felt full when she was near. The wind stirred again, faint and delicate, curling through the bare branches above, and for a moment, just for a breath, it carried their names together, hers, then his, as though the air itself had learned them and wished to keep them close. The sound was so soft, so fleeting, it might have been imagined. But Lucien felt it move through him like a lullaby, gentle and true. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, and allowed the night to cradle him. The woman leaned just slightly toward him, her shoulder brushing his, her presence anchoring him in the hush of winter. Neither spoke, neither needed to. The snow covered their footsteps behind them, erasing the trail back to the village, as though the world wanted nothing more than to preserve this stillness, this meeting in its purest form. The hilltop became a world of its own, a dream wrapped in white and silver. Lucien thought of all the years he had listened at his window, wondering if the whispers were only imagination. He thought of the nights she must have done the same, listening with her own heart, believing she was alone. And now, here they were no longer two listeners in the dark, but two presences in the same quiet, the same wind, the same snow. The thought brought him peace deeper than anything he had ever known. The wind quieted once more, settling into stillness. The stars blinked faintly overhead, soft and distant. The night sighed, as though exhaling the last of its breath, ready to sleep. And together they remained, Lucien and the woman, hand in hand, standing beneath the moon, their names resting softly in the air around them. And no need for words, no need for more. Only the calm of winter, the hush of snow, the quiet certainty that what had once been carried on the wind now belonged to them both. And as the night folded gently into dream, their hearts rested like two lanterns glowing softly in the dark, steady, warm, and full.